distinguished guests, friends, Wanakum. Can I thank you very much indeed, thank you very much indeed for the warm words of welcome. I hardly recognised the person you were describing there. When I arrived in Toronto yesterday, it was a very wet welcome, but today's more than made up for it. It's an interesting coincidence that the very first political conference I attended was a conference of my union, the National Union of Teachers. I was a teacher then, and it was held over 30 years ago in Scarborough, England. So I'm delighted here to be in Scarborough, Canada, and I thank very warmly all of you for coming, and I thank the Tamil Mirror for hosting tonight's events, and particularly Charles, the editor, for everything that he does. Shortly after I was elected to the European Parliament in 1994, having just been a teacher, I was invited to go to the southwest of England to address a group on education and Europe. And I went down one Friday evening to speak to this group of people, and I'm sure they were very pleased to see me. I have to say there were exactly the same number of people in the meeting that I addressed that evening as there are on this table here, and I'd gone all the way on a Friday evening. And at the end of the evening, the secretary of the group, she thanked me very warmly for coming. She said, "It's been a very interesting evening, we've enjoyed it all." And she said, in a sort of loud, hushed voice, she said, "What about your expenses, dear? Your expenses for the evening?" Now, you may not know, but expenses of members of the European Parliament have been a very controversial issue. And so I said to her, "Well, don't worry about that. I've just come down on a cheap return train this evening." And then there was a pause. And she said, "Oh, that is kind of you, Mr. Evans, because you can see we're a very small group. And to be honest, we haven't got a lot of funds. And what we like to do is try and save up a bit until we can invite someone good." So obviously I wasn't the person good that she was looking for. Anyway, fast forward to yesterday morning. And being serious, yesterday morning I took a minicab from my home to Heathrow Airport, which is only about 25 minutes. And it's a regular drive that I use, a friend of mine. It's called JJ, he's from Bangladesh. And it's he who got me starting to try and learn Bengali. And he asked me where I was going this time. And I said I was coming to Toronto in Canada to talk to some Tamils about the situation in Sri Lanka. And his words were, "I thought the war in Sri Lanka was over and everything was settled there now." Well, that then took up the rest of my journey to the airport, explaining to him that the war may have ended in 2009 with a vicious, cruel destruction of the Tamil people, their land, 100,000 or more deaths, and massive destruction of property and memories. But I said to him, it won't be settled in my mind, and I say to you this evening, it won't be settled until there's justice and democracy and proper representation for the Tamil people in Sri Lanka. Tonight is not my first time in Canada, nor my first time in Toronto, but it is indeed my first time here as the guests of the Tamil diaspora, and I pay tribute to the huge number of my Tamil friends in London, and to the members of my party, the Labour Party in London, where we have a few Tamil councillors in London and up and down the country, but we don't yet have in Britain a Member of Parliament of Tamil origin, and I pay enormous tribute to you, Radhika, and to the good people of this area who elected you to represent you in Parliament. And I hope I will go back to London and I will tell the people there, and they will be very jealous and very envious. But soon after I was elected to the European Parliament, some of the Tamil diaspora in London came to lobby me and tell me about what was really happening in their home country, Sri Lanka. And so began for me 18 years of involvement, which has made me many Tamil friends, some Sinhalese friends as well, but I have to say it's made me few friends with the Sri Lankan government. who don't seem to like my criticising them, and they have over a number of years been subjecting to me to abuse and threats. I made my first trip to Colombo shortly afterwards, and I met some interesting people, including the late Kumar Punambalam, who became a friend of mine. He invited me to dinner at his house, and he came to Brussels to see me, and it moved me very much when he was assassinated in 2000, and I don't believe to this day anybody has been charged with his murder. I then have been back to Sri Lanka many times since. Shortly afterwards, I went to Vavunia, and I saw the victims in a hospital, the victims of the war. And then, as a member of the European Parliament, I went on an official visit. We were hosted by the Sri Lankan government. You can imagine what they showed us. I insisted that we went to Jaffna, but they of course only showed us one side of what was going on. They said it was too dangerous to go any further. So I was determined to go back and see for myself. And with a friend, a Tamil friend from Harrow in London, and a member of Parliament, Gareth Thomas, we flew to Colombo and then on to Jaffna. And we went through the Varni, we went to Kaitidi, Chavakacheri, and we drove on to Point Pedro, through Elephant Pass and to Kilinochchi, where we sat and discussed with SP Tamil Selvan and others peace process and ideas and initiatives for how we could move things forward. I then went back and I spoke at meetings and rallies and discussed with people in London, Brussels and Strasbourg, and I went on the radio and the television criticising the government's intransigence and arguing for a peace process similar to the lines of what was happening in Northern Ireland, where other countries, the United States, seemed interested in what was happening in Northern Ireland. The rest of the world seemed interested, most countries were interested in the peace process in the Middle East, but few seemed to be interested in what happened in Sri Lanka. There were some notable exceptions, some distinguished people. The former European Commissioner, Chris Patten, was one, a different party from me, but one who I respected for his work. And of course, Eric Solheim, who I met from Norway. And I continued to work with the Tamil diaspora in London. As has been mentioned, I travelled again to Sri Lanka after the tsunami, which hit the east of the island very bad, worse than some of the other parts. But it did give me some hope, because at the time, I thought the government had almost turned a corner. The government in Colombo was prepared to help the whole of the island, that the island was united in recognising the terrible disaster that had happened. And I met people whose lives had been devastated by the war and then devastated again by the tsunami. Little did I know then that their lives were to be devastated for a third time. But it was very difficult to speak to people who'd lost all the members of their family. I remember one man I spoke to, and he told me he'd lost his mother, his wife, and his 5 children in the tsunami. And believe me, and I know you will do, there isn't anything you can say to anyone when he's just told you that he lost his mother, his wife, and his 5 children, because anything you say will be insulting. Anything you say would just not be would not recognise the pain that he must have been suffering, and I can't pretend to think that I could do. Also on that time, I went and stayed in Kilinochchi as guests of the LTTE, which I hope is not going to be counted against me by some people, but I was there. And then I was elected, to the dismay of some people, I was elected to chair the European Parliament's delegation to South Asia, which included, of course, Sri Lanka. And I accused the Sri Lankan government of involvement in the murder of Joseph Paralasingham on Christmas Day 2005, another person that I'd met. And I did question whether the government was really interested in peace and whether they wanted to do anything about human rights abuses. I secured a resolution in the European Parliament that actually was critical of the Sri Lankan government. And I led in 2008 what turned out to be a very controversial mission to Sri Lanka. We met President Rajapaksa, and I can remember to this day, he was sitting in a chair with big wooden arms, and he had a number of rings on his hands. And I said, we had heard a lot of stories and seen a lot of evidence that suggested there were human rights abuses in his country. And he was silent. I said, we've also met a number of journalists who say they're scared to write what they really think for fear of what will happen to him. And then he was still silent for a while. And then I remember, and I can still hear the noise as he banged his hands on the arm of his chair and the rings banged on the wood. And he said, there are no human rights abuses in this country. Journalists can write what they want without fear of being attacked by anyone. And again, there wasn't very much I could say to him after that because it didn't fit in with what I'd heard and what I'd seen and what I knew. On that visit, the government of Sri Lanka wanted us to fly to Batticaloa and to meet Pilian, and they wanted me to meet him on the steps of the aeroplane and shake hands with him, and I said I wouldn't do that, and an almighty row broke out. I said I would be prepared to go to Batticaloa and meet Amnesty International and talk with them, but that I didn't wish to, I would meet Pilian privately, but I would not meet him on the steps of the aeroplane and I wouldn't shake hands publicly with him. So the trip to Batticaloa was cancelled. This made me the subject of an unbelievable amount of vitriol and abuse from the Colombo government through their ambassador to Brussels, who devoted his time and energy solely to conducting a vendetta against me, to undermine my work and to threaten me. And then, of course, we came to the final battle of 2009, when I have to say, it was, to me, so desperately frustrating that the world stood back and did nothing. I pleaded with ministers in London, officials in Brussels, and anyone who would listen, that they should do something. But I'm afraid the world stood by as hospitals were bombed deliberately, and hundreds of thousands of ordinary lives were sacrificed in an orgy of war. I called for UN peacekeeping troops. UN sends peacekeeping troops to all parts of the world, it seems, but it didn't happen in Colombo because the government controlled access through the airport. I argued that the Commonwealth, Canada, Britain, Sri Lanka are all members of the Commonwealth, that the Commonwealth should take a stand and deal with the inhumane regime in Colombo. But they didn't seem to want to get involved. They didn't want to criticize another member. And it's ironic, you know, that the Sri Lankan government is described as the democratic socialist government of Sri Lanka. To my mind, there's nothing democratic about it, and there's nothing socialist about it. It's barely a government of the whole country of Sri Lanka, so it doesn't sit up there. And of course, you know that the end of the war and the deaths, and then they set up the camps, detention centres, concentration camps, Manic Farm, but they wouldn't open them up to the world's media, and they were ashamed of what they were doing. David Miliband, the distinguished former Foreign Secretary of Britain and brother of the current leader of the Labour Party, he did go to Sri Lanka. He did try and speak up, but he only went and he was only shown what the Sri Lankan government wanted him to see. That I sidetracked slightly because I was delighted to see that Frances Harrison is here. She and I, well, I was at the launch of her book in the House of Commons in London about 2 weeks ago. So we meet in different parts of the world. If the journalists are tracking, they'd wonder what on earth's going on, why we meet in these strange places. If you can say that it's strange, the House of Commons and this conference centre is strange. But I've read her book and I've read it twice. It's one of those books that you read it once and then you get to the end and you want to start and read it again. I was referring there to David Miliband, and Frances in her book writes, and this has actually surprised me because it's critical of my government, my party, the Labour Party, and she says, it's not widely known, but from 2001 to 2008, the United Kingdom issued more arms exports licenses for Sri Lanka than any other country in Europe, selling arms such as semi-automatic pistols, components for combat aircraft, armoured vehicles, military sonar detection, grenades and military communications equipment. The then Shadow Defence Secretary, Conservative Liam Fox, was also busy visiting Sri Lanka in March 2009 to discuss investment and reconstruction in the north at a time when appalling crimes were being committed. Sri Lanka needed money to buy all those weapons when the war was at its fiercest. And she concludes this passage by saying, the failure of the United Nations to protect Tamil civilians was symptomatic of the indifference of the world as a whole. And those words are very true, and I commend Francis's book to you as a distinguished work that will contribute to the history of South Asia and to the history of Sri Lanka. Earlier this year, I read an article in the magazine. One of my interests is cricket, and there's a magazine, The Cricketer, and I wrote an article that began by saying, there's never been a better time to visit Sri Lanka. It wrote that the war was over, the country was an idyllic place to be travelling, and the cricket, there was a test match series earlier in the year, and then a 2020 competition very recently, and it said there has never been a better time. I rang up the editor of The Cricketer, and I had a long chat with him. I thought it was a good conversation, and I said to him, that piece that your journalist wrote, there is another side to that. And he said, oh, and I explained to him, similarly what I've explained to you tonight. He said, well, would you like to write a piece, put in the other side of the story from a cricket point of view? And I said I'd be very pleased to, and that was what I was hoping would come out of the conversation. So I wrote a piece, put in the other side, and my last line was, in short, I believe there could not be a worse time for the England cricket team to be visiting Sri Lanka. The editor sent me an email back saying, thank you very much for your contribution. We feel it's a bit too political for the Cricketer magazine, and it, of course, wasn't published. It was published in a very minor journal called Tribune, which has a circulation of about 8,000, but it wasn't published in the cricket magazine. But I don't believe that the rest of the world should be playing cricket against Sri Lanka. I don't believe that tourists should be encouraged to go there in large numbers. The world did not stand and forever let South Africa get on with apartheid. We opposed it. We issued a boycott against South Africa playing in sport. We should do the same against Sri Lanka at the moment, whilst they stand accused of war crimes and refuse to allow proper investigations into what went on in 2009 and what continues to go on. They should not be allowed to participate in all of those events. And that was the message that I also took earlier this year in March when I went to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, where with great support, and I pay tribute to the TGTE, we lobbied the delegates to the Human Rights Council, and we're very pleased that by 24 votes to 15, with 8 abstentions, they voted for a resolution that was critical of the Sri Lankan government and asked them to address the alleged violations of international law. It hasn't actually happened yet, but we live in hope, and we continue to put pressure on that. And Canada has been a country that's put even more pressure on and has issued stronger resolutions in the past. And I'm very pleased to see that your government, I applaud Prime Minister Stephen Harper saying that Stephen Harper has said, I understand, that he won't attend the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which is due to be held in Sri Lanka next year. I hope he stands to his word, but I actually hope that the Commonwealth looks again and doesn't hold the Heads of Government meeting in Colombo, because I think it would be an insult to the rest of the Commonwealth, to the ideals of the Commonwealth, if it were to hold its Heads of Government meeting where the head of the host government stands accused of war crimes in his name, and I don't think that should happen. I thought it was a shame, to say the very least, that Her Majesty the Queen invited President Rajapaksa to London to her Diamond Jubilee celebrations. I wouldn't want someone at my Jubilee party with his hands dripping with blood, the blood of his own people, but I'm afraid he was allowed to come to Britain. I think we have got to continue this pressure on Sri Lankan government. If the world is silent, good people do nothing. And you as a community here in Canada, you've been articulate and voiced your real concern about what's happening in your home country. The whole international community must keep talking, keep on speaking up for peace, for minorities, and keep on arguing for democracy in Sri Lanka. An inclusive democracy that not only recognises Tamils, but awards a role in the constitution to Tamil parties, giving them a real, meaningful voice and a proper right to vote for whom they want. If we do this together, you here, me and others in the United Kingdom, in Europe, other countries in the Commonwealth, millions of other expatriate Tamils and other good people around the whole globe, then we can and we will make a difference. Some people would have argued years ago that apartheid would never be abolished in South Africa. Plenty of people thought we'd never get peace across the religious divide in Northern Ireland. But those examples of change that did happen should give us hope and should give us inspiration for the future. Your presence here tonight and your work, thousands of kilometres from your home, inspires me and will continue to do so. Nandri Wanakum.